I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And Jen Percy wrote a book that some of you will remember called Demon Camp. And it was a Discover Great New Writers pick back in the day. And it is one of the most exceptional books I've read about trauma, and especially PTSD in soldiers. And actually, yeah, I have done a bunch of reading there because if you live in the world and you want to know what's going on, understanding trauma is actually something that we should all try a little harder to figure out. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but I do think story is one of the ways that gets us through. And Jen has a new book called Girls Play Dead. And like Demon Camp, it really, she's looking at aftermath. And she's looking at the aftermath of situations that many of us will be familiar with. And so in this conversation, we're sort of going to stretch a little bit and talk about Jen's background as a writer. She's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. She's also a working journalist. You've seen her byline in the New York Times Magazine. You've seen it in the New Republic. And I know I'm missing something else. Was it Harper's, Jen? Am I?
Harper's, yeah.
Harper's. Okay, sorry, doing this off the top of my head. And this is long form journalism. She has covered conflict in Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq and has a lot of stories. But also, first and foremost, really, writer of books, teller of stories. I'm really happy to see you, Jen. Thank you for making the time.
Yeah, thank you.
So wait, I know that Girls Play Dead started as a story for the Times in the Times Magazine in 2023. But having just reread Demon Camp as I was prepping for this show and thinking about the wives and girlfriends of some of the soldiers you met while you were researching and reporting Demon Camp, I feel like some of Girls Play Dead started there in that book, which you were writing as you were at the Iowa Writers Workshop, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. So that was one of my first projects, really. I kind of approached writing, my career writing, in the sort of reverse order you're supposed to, where I didn't publish a lot of magazine pieces or in journals. I just went for the book.
Right.
Um, but it's funny you bring that up because when my husband read Girls Play Dead, he was like, "Oh, you just wrote Demon Camp again," basically, but it's in a completely different context. And most people wouldn't necessarily make that connection right away. But I think what he's talking about is that I'm obsessed with aftermath and trauma and how people tell stories about suffering. And those are the primary themes of the two books. But I have a lot of writing that came into this book that I've been working on for a decade almost. And the New York Times article was actually, it didn't trigger the book. That was already in process.
Okay, so
otherwise it would have been the fastest book ever.
Okay.
I mean, that was just a couple of years ago.
You've been writing on deadline for a really long time. I mean, you've done these reporting trips, and then suddenly we get a giant sort of feature magazine story out of it. And I'm like, how quickly do you write?
I don't know, it's interesting you say that because I always feel like I'm not fast enough, but I'm sure everyone feels that way. And it's with nonfiction writing too, it's just there's so much involved with the project that's not even writing. It's logistics and fact checking and transcript, just like recording that travel and so the whole process usually takes. I mean, I think the fastest I had to turn around was 4 months, but usually it could take up to a year on average, I think. Yeah.
So you start reporting Demon Camp in what, the early aughts? Do I have that right? You're looking for people and you find Caleb sort of in what, 09?
Yeah,
10?
I think it was a little later than that, around 2000. Yeah, 2010. That sounds about right.
So part of why I want to keep these books connected, I don't disagree with your husband. I do think you've written thematically. The books are siblings. They are absolutely
They're
thematic.
siblings. That's a better term.
Thematic siblings, without a doubt. But I think the way we as a society talk about what happens in aftermath, right? Whether it's a hurricane or an earthquake or fires, any kind of natural disaster too. Like you could even fit that into the conversation that we're having about war and sexual assault.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way you focus on language in both books and the failures of language to help participants through to the other side is really where I want to sit the longest with in this conversation, because I do think it's really interesting that you have written books, really, really good books, about how hard it is for us as humans to talk about any of this and make sense of it. And it's partially because we've made decisions about what the words mean, right? Like
Mhm.
PTSD, you hear the phrase PTSD, and suddenly it's like, well, this is what X, Y, and Z means. And it's like, well, actually, it's more complicated than that.
Mhm.
So I want to talk about your own story, though. You bring in some family story that I didn't know until I read Girls Play Dead. Um, your mom was an outdoors woman. Like,
She was.
can we start with your mom and then work backwards to your grandmother? Because I feel like we're a little more grounded with your mom's story, and your grandmother's story kind of made me raise an eyebrow.
Yeah, let's start with my mom.
Um, but she, I mean, is it fair to say she broke her back? Like, I mean, this is a really extreme situation.
She fell down a cliff because her supervisor sort of insisted she do something unsafe and she didn't want to cause a scene. And yeah, she does talk about it as breaking her back
Right.
in conversation. Um, and I didn't really actually piece together my mom's story until after I
Mm-hmm.
wrote the whole book,
Okay.
which is maybe interesting to think about in conversation with some of the themes. So it was sort of me going back to select images of my mom where I felt like we could sort of defamiliarize some of these conversations, in a more political context. So just these very personal moments that I've seen in my past, and kind of almost inviting the reader to do that too for their own lives.
I mean, one of the first thoughts I had when I was reading your mom's story too is, there's this idea of being a good girl, right? And that you're not
Mhm.
going to cause, and I'm just like, but your mom is like your mom is doing backcountry hiking that I would never do, right? Like
Yeah, yeah,
I'm down for a nice, well, I'm good for like a 9 mile in and out box canyon, but like that's not backcountry, right? Like I
yeah.
like,
And my mom is a badass.
right.
She's out in the woods in the sticks. That's the only place she wanted to be.
But she's working this is the early 70s, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay. So she's working in a male dominated field in the early 70s and doesn't want to cause trouble and ends up really hurting herself significantly.
exactly. Yeah, it was all men. I mean, she was among, she was in the lumber yard. I mean, the
Hmm.
worst place you could be.
And it's isolated and it's the
It's
70s,
pornography on the
all of it.
walls. It's just horrible.
But she's there because she knows her work. She's there because she knows her job.
Hmm.
And yet she's in this really untenable position. So your mother, somewhere along the line, like many of us, was taught to be well behaved, right? To go along, get along, all of this kind of thing. But then you introduce us to your grandmother. And I'm trying to put sort of the two together. Because was it your maternal grandmother who basically joined a cult?
She, yes, abandoned my mother's family and joined, what's defined as a cult, a huge cult that went to
Hmm.
Montana and really
Okay.
just actually went into bunkers and waited for the apocalypse.
And that was also in the 70s, or was that like the early 80s? Or,
Um,
oh no, that would have been the 60s. I'm sorry, my timeline is backwards.
I can't remember the exact date. I remember it took me a while to find the exact date for the
Hmm.
end of the world, but it was around there. So,
Okay.
but my mom was old enough to witness it, to react
Right.
to it, to tell me those details. Yeah.
And here's her mom choosing what might not be considered an average path, right? Like, I'm going to leave my kids behind and I'm going to go live in a bunker in the mountains somewhere. And yet your mom becomes very much her own person, very much, figures out her own stuff. And there's still this seed at the back of her brain that I have to get along.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think everything she does is sort of um, both resisting sort of societal pressures to be a girl and then being sort of slapped in the face when she does it, and trying to figure out how to, cause as little controversy as possible. And basically that was kind of her struggle, her tension. She still feels like she didn't get far enough, get to do what she wanted.
Hmm.
And when she was telling me these stories, it felt like there was always a male authority that was bringing her down. But also maybe my uh her mother-in-law, so my father's grandma, was also
Hmm.
telling her that she was not a good girl and not a proper woman, and so she was struggling with that role as well. um but it's interesting to think about like what she has inherited and been conditioned to think, and how that's passed on between the generations too. So I felt like she was trying to teach me to be like stoic and intense in a way that was helpful to her, but it wasn't necessarily helpful to how I, process suffering or vulnerability.
I mean, I'm going to be queen of the obvious for a second, Jen. You're a war correspondent. I mean, you
Exactly.
you have covered female warlords in Pakistan, and that story still makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck. You have covered militias. Um, I mean, I do hope people go back and look for some of that coverage. It is wild when I think of you, because you're also not the tallest person, right? Like you're gen-sized and you're out there and you
Yeah.
are chasing stories that not everyone would want necessarily to chase. I mean, how do you go from the Iowa Writers Workshop to Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria?
Well, I mean, do you mean technically, or I mean, I think what you're saying is related to my mom's teachings too. Like,
Hmm.
I think I, and I think she regretted it once she found out I was going to just be a strong woman. And then once she realized it was that kind of a thing I was pursuing, she
Right.
obviously didn't support that. But I think that and I talk about it a little bit in the book, kind of a breakdown I had
Hmm.
after those experiences. So my attempt to maintain a sense of self and not feel, it wasn't that I was trying not to feel traumatized, but I didn't necessarily um, I wasn't really interested in self care or
Hmm.
understanding like that this might, um, you know, cause self harm in the process. It was, I mean, some of the experiences I had were extremely difficult,
Hmm.
and I'm still processing them.
Right.
We had to run from sniper fire one day, just all of a sudden out of nowhere, just no preparation, not really realizing I was going into those situations. So it
Hmm.
wasn't like I wanted to always be, you know, so I think some people do go towards that. I
Hmm.
was trying to avoid it, but then sometimes things are out of your control when you're, doing international reporting in conflict
Right.
zones. So those kind of situations can end up being deeply traumatizing. And also just, I mean, some of the stories I heard after talking to survivors of genocide, I mean, those I feel like have changed me forever. And so I think, though, the actual part of all of that, I've, I think that makes it even more difficult was that I was sort of in a very male dominated world, and I
Hmm.
felt like talking about things wasn't normal. I felt like I had no one to lean on when I was doing that reporting. I felt like men were yelling at me all the time when I was over there.
Hmm.
It it didn't feel good,
Right.
and I can't do that kind of work when I don't have any other kind of support. So it in a way, I started thinking more about that great Claire Bay Watkins essay about pandering to men, and I kind of felt like that's what I was doing after a while. Like,
Hmm.
even though I love that work and I think it's important, and there was part of it that had nothing to do with what I'm about to say now, but a lot of it was, I do think, pushed by this idea that I had to prove something about myself
Hmm.
to men and like men's tastes,
Hmm.
that I could do this kind of work. Because even when writing Demon Camp, I felt like people immediately dismissed me, like, don't go do that. That sounds dangerous. Why would you do that as a woman? Or they're overly obsessed with myself as a woman in a situation. And that's
Right.
all they were interested in. Um, And so I do feel like Girls Play Dead was a bit of a reaction to that, where I could just write about whatever I wanted in my life that felt totally unimportant, like just men staring at you on the bus or something, like, which after writing about genocide survivors feels like the most irrelevant thing in the world. But I just allowed myself to indulge in those experiences, which are usually sort of dismissed. So I think that it opened up a lot of space for me to explore.
But it's also a form of experiential nonfiction, right? Like, this is, if you look at Demon Camp as immersive journalism, right? Like, you are in, there are a couple of moments where I'm like, Jen, don't open that door. I mean, I'm going to read what you write, but please don't open that door. And you do it and you walk through it and we get a cool book out of it. But certainly with Girls Play Dead, I mean, there's a scene setting you need to do. There is a lot of setup that you need, because each chapter is taking on a different sort of idea, right? Like
Mhm.
Demon Camp, you could always come back to Caleb Daniels, who's sort of the heart of this book, and his response to life when he comes back from Afghanistan after 8 of his fellows were in a helicopter that crashed, and he does not die. He is pulled aside at the last minute and does not go out with them, and he's living with quite a lot of guilt when he gets back. So Caleb, we always keep coming back to, but in Girls Play Dead, you've got a larger cast. It
Mhm.
is a nationwide cast. There are, it seems like a range of ages,
Mhm.
and certainly backgrounds and everything else. Poverty is something that pops in a lot of these stories. A lot of these folks
Mhm.
are not well off financially and find themselves in situations that are probably likely exacerbated by their poverty. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so how do you go from, here's this one person that I'm going to focus on, right? And so you're interviewing people sort of around Caleb as well. But this is a much bigger range of people. So how do you go about finding them and also figuring out who's willing to talk to you?
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a great question. So I began really with freezing,
Okay.
and I interviewed as many women as I could get.
Mm-hmm.
How do I find them? That was actually a bit easier because it's people have been starting to talk about it at least, and people I think we're excited to tell those stories. But going through agencies, going through shelters, sending them an email, telling
Mm-hmm.
them what I'm doing, having women get back to me saying they want to tell their stories. So that's how
Yeah.
I started. Um, but in those stories, so I didn't know where this book was going to go, or if it could be a book until I did the freezing section, because
Mm-hmm.
really every time I spoke to someone, they ended up introducing this other really mysterious at the time response to sexual assault.
Okay.
And so I would take notes about that and then kind of have to come back to it or say, like, I'm going to investigate this now. That'll be the next chapter. This will be a chapter ahead of that. But many of the women, even though I'll write about some of their behaviors and isolation, exhibited quite a few different, I mean, freezing almost across the board
Right.
was always part of it. And then, as I mentioned in the book, one woman was just kind of as an aside, like, oh, by the way, I had these psychogenic non-epileptic seizures
Right.
after rape. And she even described it brilliantly as a kind of freezing too, where she's like, I was trapped in my body, literally,
Mm-hmm.
with no control of it. So she was like, maybe that's relevant to your research. And I was like, yes, absolutely. Never heard of this. And then I go out, find out it's really common after sexual
Mm-hmm.
assault. There's whole communities talking about it, whole swaths of women saying no one believes them. And it was, um, just kind of kept moving forward in that way, where
Mm-hmm.
I just kept finding more and more things that um, women would reveal in their interviews that say, like, I don't know, this thing just happened, but I don't know how to talk about it. And then I would just put pressure on that. So, even with the, orgasming during rape or feeling pleasure, that came up really early.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I just kind of put it aside for a bit and then went back to it later to see, like, how many women do this, talk to experts. So it kind of just that's kind of how I progressed forward. But really, the each chapter meditates on a kind of frozen woman. Like it's a bit of a leitmotif or metaphor throughout, and so that kind of kept the structure um, controlled in a way, or put sort of a box around it. But I think that, you know, like you were saying, sort of having this long entryway into the book and getting the reader ready for these experiences was important, and sort of showing uh, a range, also just like the microaggression to more
Hmm.
violent rape, and showing that there's going to be a multiplicity of voices here also is a kind of preparation you have to do, I think, for a reader.
Hmm. Hmm.
And yeah.
There's also, huh, we're going to do show and tell for a second because I went out and bought a copy of
Agree.
Metamorphoses.
Yeah.
Ovid. There are quite a lot of references to specifically this book. And I was not an English major in college. I was a history person. So I have missed some of these things like Ovid. Um, but the larger metaphor really works. So I want to spend a minute talking about bringing in, like you also talk about Annie Ernaux, and you talk about Helen
Hmm.
Garner and Adrienne Rich, and of course Tim O'Brien, and the things they carried. Um, I just want to talk about using other forms of literature, poetry, fiction to help tell this story.
Yeah, I think that when we're talking about something that at the outset, most people say that's not real or I don't believe this happens.
Right.
Not only doing this, reporting, listening to stories, but going into history and literature to find examples just, helps make the argument airtight, but also shows how much we've ignored these kinds of
Mm,
responses historically. And I mean, Ovid, I wouldn't have seen it reading it in college or whenever
right.
I read it the first time, but going back to it, um, just these women transforming into trees or animals or solid objects to escape rape. It's just really capturing the freeze response, this paralysis response that no one really talks about. And there were even, quite a few classicists studying this response in relationship to trauma, looking at these early studies of like, what does a raped woman look like back then? How do they talk about it? And
Right.
it was really interesting to see that Ovid was actually writing about, these subtle responses that women are having that looked like complicity, but were actually signs of trauma. And so I think that just showing that the historical arc of this attention we have give or not given to trauma responses shows not only that we have known about it, but that we've actively decided to suppress that knowledge in like on an institutional level or in the media or conversations generally. But it's always been there. I mean, and even with the tonic mobility, even though most people are like, "What is that?" Women don't actually experience it's a literal paralysis, which is just so wild. But we've known since the 1970s, at least we've been studying it in humans. So there's something that just it makes me sad looking at it to know that how actively we've covered it up.
And coming back to language, right? I mean, it is all about the language and the way we choose to describe situations and responses and whatnot. You have a line in the book where you say self-preservation doesn't always look like we think it does. And
Yeah.
that's partially intellectual judgments, right? Like that's people saying, well, I just simply will not believe you. Or it's also a failure of language. So the idea that we
Mhm.
can take layered, I mean, if you live on the internet, right, like nuance is dead. I think that is a very safe
Right.
statement. Like, and most of us have to live on the internet in some form or another in this day and age. Like, whether we, I mean, yes, we can choose to actively not participate, but also we live in the world, so you just have to do what's right for you. But
Mhm.
that this idea that story should be able to help us through it, which
Mhm.
that's my point of view, but yet we have so many examples of where story has failed us and where
Yeah.
language has like actively failed us.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. I think that, I mean, there's so many examples of it. I think going back to these three women in prison is
Yep.
the most poignant and
Hmm.
horrifying example of that, because the whole sort of argument of this chapter, which tells these three women's stories who killed an abuser in self-defense, but with a lot of buildup before that, a lot of
Hmm.
struggle, intersection of racism, poverty, sexual abuse as children. It's common to all three.
Hmm.
So they go and they tell their stories. Well, first, some of them don't get to tell their stories at all. They just take a plea deal. But then they
Right.
tell their stories to this lawyer who spends 5 years with them. And then they go back with a new law allows them to go back and relitigate the case. So they, or resentence the case. And so the judge gets to hear their stories again. And in all cases, it didn't matter. Even though there were findings that they were sexually abused, there was domestic violence, that
Hmm.
they were resisting and fighting back for their own,
Hmm.
because they didn't want to die, basically. And so that chapter really made me actually question just our culture's obsession with idealizing storytelling as a way to save everyone,
Hmm.
and that's not always true. I mean, I
Right.
do think like stories can save ourselves, if we tell ourselves stories and they can
Hmm.
make our lives easier, but just telling a truthful story, we always think that's going to help someone. If only people knew. And sometimes that doesn't actually help them. And I had to kind of reckon with that feeling at the end of that reporting trip, because I went into it thinking if only people knew these stories, these women would be let out of jail.
Right.
And I didn't, I mean, on the drive back, I already knew that wasn't true.
Hmm.
It was the topic of conversation was they were all like, what are you doing here? We've already told our story.
Right.
This isn't going to matter. So I think that that was sort of the point of like, even when you have the language, sometimes it doesn't matter. And maybe it's because you're poor or because of your race or because of sexism or all these factors. But even before that, I think what you're saying is really important about like, yeah, it's not that we just don't believe women, it's that even when we have whatever language is available to tell the stories, we don't really understand what they're talking about necessarily. We don't have the research on what they're experiencing, or there's some disconnect between, it's like if a woman says, I froze, I kind of talk about in the book how that could mean 10 million different things. Like
Right.
there's not a specificity to the language that's sort of universal.
It's the
And then some
context,
things,
right?
yeah,
Like it's
yeah,
the
exactly.
context. We're missing huge, huge pieces of context, or we've chosen to sort of put them on the shelf and be like, oh, I'm going to go think about this other piece and not
Yeah,
how
yeah,
they intersect. You talk about this in a similar way with Demon Camp, right? With the language of
yeah.
PTSD and how we treat soldiers who have returned from active duty in war zones. And it's not dissimilar. And in fact, some of those soldiers have also experienced freezing in
Mhm.
battlefield situations because the trauma is so extreme and the human body can only process so much. Like your
Right.
neuroscience knows that the human body can only hit so much. And thinking about like freezing, right? And this metaphor of freezing, like it happens in
Right,
so
right.
many places in so many ways. And yet then we come back to language and it's like, well, okay, how do I, right? Like, how do we bring the nuance? How do we bring the context back?
Right. And why is it so shameful
Hmm.
still? I mean, I feel like the greatest thing about giving people this language is that it will be a solve to self-blame and shame,
Hmm.
um, which I think might even be more difficult to give to soldiers.
Hmm.
Um, than it would be sexual assault victims who seem to, really feel empowered by that
Hmm.
language and that community. Whereas, I didn't kind of go into looking at freezing too deeply in the context of soldiers at war and how they would
Hmm.
respond to that. But it certainly, with at least a female soldier,
Hmm.
have, and as an example in the book, her story was completely dismissed because a military council decided that if you were raped, you would have to scream and fight back. And
Hmm.
she was around people when she was raped, and they just were like, "That's not possible," even though we all know it's possible. I
Right.
mean, we have that in the literature. We have studies on it. Um, so there's a huge disconnect between, you know, what people want things to look like and the reality. And science seems to be a bridge to that. But even we can see in the situation, like, why isn't the science there?
Hmm. Hmm. But also, I mean, fear and shame seem to be the two pieces that are deeply overwhelming for anyone, right? Like whether we're talking about someone who survived sexual assault or whether we're talking about a soldier who has survived, a trauma on the battlefield. Those are that's where language seems to fail us the most, even when we have, studies and stories and first person narratives. It it seems like as a society, we still haven't figured out how to talk about those things in a way that doesn't belittle the experience of either.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think this sort of phrase I have in the chapter on agoraphobia, just like, what do we look like when we're afraid?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we don't quite know what that is yet.
Mm-hmm.
Or even when you're experiencing fear, your perception of what you might look like is maybe different from what people are seeing. So a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
women who are having panic attacks were actually completely frozen and not moving, and maybe no one would even notice that they're having a panic attack. But on the
Right.
inside, they felt like they were completely dissolving, and they were
Right.
having moments where they actually felt like the borders of their body were gone, or they were acting out. And misbehaving is kind of the term that they connected to that experience. It's not how they're
Mm-hmm.
supposed to act. So there's so much about that fear behavior that has been historically defined in the context of shame, which
Mm-hmm.
is really interesting. Like, why is that? And yeah, I think we can all think about moments with, like, if someone's choking, for example, what do? They usually, like, go to the bathroom, lock the door. I
Right.
mean, and even animals do that. Like, if when they're sick, they, like, go away and be alone. I mean, there's just this, like, feeling of being watched and judged when we are responding to terror. And I think part of that is because so our brain shuts down. We're literally in altered state. So we act in a way we can't anticipate or even
Mm-hmm.
understand necessarily all the time. So it is kind of like feeling out of control and being out of control. And that can
Right.
feel really shameful because we might expect to act one way and then we don't. And there's a disconnect. And, sometimes we may never really know how we're going to react. So it's, especially when gendered scripts come into play,
Mm-hmm.
that's, I think, very difficult to kind of understand, which I didn't know until I wrote this book, that, like, even though all of our brains are kind of the same in terms of reacting to terror, the gendered scripts, and sort of social norms, are the first behaviors that we start to act on if we still even have the ability to act. And those can be very, very embarrassing for people.
I mean, I would love to see us get to a place where we can have actual conversations about fear and shame and how we bring that, I mean, how we share it with each other. I mean, the reality is too, like, especially when I look at some of the stories in Girls Play Dead, I mean, it's not just the person who has survived being assaulted that is impacted. I mean, that
Mhm,
person's entire circle,
mhm,
family, friends, colleague, like it's never just one person who is entirely impacted. It becomes sort of a structural thing. And we're not even looking at that piece. We're just kind of going, oh, right, okay.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And one psychologist I talked to said, the first and most important sort of reaction to the story, the someone admitting that they were raped or talking about it, is like what determines sort of their journey after that. So that response is really important. That's usually a friend,
Mm-hmm.
someone they know, and so they're not going to probably go to the police first or to a social worker even. So those responses among all of us, just regular people in the world, really do matter.
Mm-hmm.
Because even if you ask a lot of questions or don't quite understand, like it's not even that you don't believe their story, but you don't even understand what they're talking about. It can be confusing. I mean, I remember trying to explain this moment where I had a flashback during COVID of
Mm-hmm.
from when I was war reporting, and it sounds completely insane. I don't know when, I mean, there's no other way to talk about it without just making a surrealist painting. Basically, it's just
Mm-hmm.
like the wall felt like it was opening up and there's like a helicopter in the room. And I just think like it's um if you're trying to use the tools of like ordinary narrative to talk
Mm-hmm.
about that, it sounds like you're lying or you don't remember something or you
Right.
you had a psychic break or in a way that's not aligned with you know what happened before, because that happened like 5 years earlier, so that may not make sense to someone if I'm telling them that. So same thing for sexual assault narratives.
But we also have a history of romanticizing war,
Yeah,
right? Like if you think
exactly.
of the great, even things like, The Good Soldier, or people forget that Mrs. Dalloway is actually a novel about war, right? Like, okay. And
Yeah,
I have honestly read some great, great, great stories and novels about war. Like it is absolutely literature that we need, without a doubt. But there is a level of romanticization that we hand over to it, that we would not give other narratives.
absolutely. Yeah, it's so interesting to think about that. And in the end, yeah, I talk about, you know, it's not that embarrassing or shameful for me to talk about those war experiences exactly because of what you're saying.
Hmm.
This long legacy of um, making those part of the greatest works of literature, romanticizing these journeys. And that's absolutely not true for sexual assault victims. They don't have that legacy. And I think that's something that we're starting to build and talk about. But
Hmm.
right now, we don't quite have that space for them to talk about stories in a way that's anything but typical. And any, surrealism or these sort of altered states, that's scary for a sexual assault victim to talk about.
But
It's not romanticized.
no, and also our brains, the way we form memories, get changed by traumatic events. Like literally, our brain chemistry changes, our physical brain tissue changes, and we
Right.
can't form memories. And I'm using, obviously the larger royal we, um, in this context, because it can be for any number of situations. Like this is not something that is limited to survivors of sexual assault. Like we need to expand our definitions, right? Like because I think
Yeah.
that's partially where some of this like moral finger shaking comes from, where it's like, I mean, people have big feelings about a lot of things. But I think if we can expand our definitions and expand the conversations and hold doors open for more people to participate in them, I think that gets us closer to, I don't know, is healthy the word I want to use? I don't know if healthy is the word I want to use, but it'll have to do in this context. It's having now read Girls Play Dead a couple of times, and it's a really satisfying read, but it is not easy. I will be perfectly honest about it. It's not a book you rush through. Um, I still think your grandma's a trip. Sorry. I
Mm.
just like I was just like, what am I reading? Um, but for you now that it's done, I mean, this was a really intense reporting experience. It's a really intense writing experience. Plus, you've got to figure out the structure, right? Like, you can't just take
Mhm.
your notes and dump it and be like, hey, I have a thing now. There is an arc to each of the pieces. Like, there's an absolute arc to the chapters. How does it feel for you having it out in the world now? I mean, now it's in readers' hands.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm just very happy to be done. And I think that, I mean, what I really loved writing this book, despite
Mm-hmm.
some of the dark subject matter. I I felt like I was really connecting to the subjects, and I
Mm-hmm.
felt like I was also there's something really satisfying about I'm writing about this huge topic that's part of our, you know, political landscape,
Mm-hmm.
the aftermath of Me Too. It's almost like there's this worry at the beginning. Oh, there's a big worry at the beginning. It's like people are going to be like, "Oh, what else is there to say about this? We've
Mm-hmm.
already talked about sexual assault. There's
Mm-hmm.
nothing left to say."
Right.
And so I found this space where I did feel like I was like, I'm going to push really hard into this.
Mm-hmm.
The fear responses, the neuroscience, the misunderstood trauma behaviors, how that translates to, the self and on the institutional level. But so I feel like just going into that space and doing it and finding that material feels like I'm, you know, going to hopefully create some conversation. I hope
Mm-hmm.
people start talking about this more. I hope it helps people. And then at the same time, I felt like I have made it into a book that's very, I focus on sentences, I focus on the literary nature of it. I want it to be satisfying in terms of storytelling. I didn't want it to feel like a polemic. I didn't want people to
Mm-hmm.
feel like they're being told how to think. I wanted to just put a lot of ideas out there and complicate a situation and have it be an experience. And so I'm hoping those two things can really make it stick, and create an emotional response for readers, and that it will kind of bring us back to some of those threads that were lost during Me Too, where it's not just about, getting the bad guy and putting him in jail. And that was a huge part of it, but like there's a lot more going on.
Truman Capote was a big part of your inspiration. I'm going to use that word for Demon Camp, and how you tell a story where you think you know what's happening, kind of thing. You also use James Agee's "Let Us Now Praise Famous Men," which is
Mm,
a book I really love. Um, and it's wild how much that book still stands and stands up. And
yeah,
he wrote it in what, the 30s?
yeah.
Okay.
So
Are there any sort of direct literary influences for Girls Play Dead? Because I feel like you're doing something really different structurally in Girls Play Dead. I mean, it's not, I mean, it is a single narrative, yes, but you do have to work with a much larger cast. You do have to, you're pulling memoir and reportage and scientific research. I mean, they're all pieces that, well, it could have gotten clunky and it didn't because it's you. Um, but are you thinking about anything sort of in the back of your brain as you're telling these stories and linking them together?
yeah, and that was difficult. And I tried to withhold editing or thinking about imposing structure until I was really deep, basically
Mm-hmm.
to the
Mm-hmm.
end. And
Okay.
then I thought, okay, what about, you know, my words, my text? What is it telling me about how to structure the piece, or what would I normally try to cut out, but maybe I'm gonna rethink it. So I tried to think more about this, like there's a lot of voices, is one thing. So
Mm.
I decided to leave leave all the voices, as many as I could. And I think this bringing in of different materials and multiplicity of voices is very much like a subversive structure in a way. I mean, it kind of is formally enacting what the argument is, where it's like, let these women talk, let us hear their stories, let us hear all of the stories, even if some
Mm-hmm.
are like Some are just a couple sentences, they're just like little gasps in the
Right.
book, and some are
Right.
longer. But I kind of let them tell their stories in whatever world they're living in. Like there's I try to maintain some internal logic of their lives, without over explaining anything. So I just felt like that was really important, to giving them power and focusing on their storytelling. And I think this, I mean, it feels like something that has like a long feminist tradition. I mean, there's so many writers that use fragmentation and multiplicity of voices to kind of show like there's no one male voice or authoritative voice, or
Hmm.
let's look at how like a fragmented identity is actually useful
Hmm.
and real. And I don't try to like make it feel fragmented, but it kind
Right.
of is in the way that it's taking all these little pieces and weaving them together, as opposed to like a collage form like Maggie Nelson's Bluets,
Yep.
etc. So I didn't want to do that, but I still wanted it to feel like a landscape, like this is like what America looks like when I go overseas. But I
Hmm.
didn't want it to be just like five profiles or
Right.
um I wanted there to feel like you're walking down the street and like, oh, you're telling me your story, you're telling me your story. Like there's this variety and texture and strangeness that comes at you that is kind of actually what you would feel like in real life if you were just talking to women, as
Yeah.
opposed to like overly curating it. So I wanted to feel a little bit messy, even though I hope it also feels very organized.
It's not messy. This is where I'm going to step in and say it's not messy. It is, however, it's very organic. It is, um, there is narrative momentum, which, when you're reading nonfiction, any reader needs, right? You can't, it's not
Yeah,
enough to have beautiful sentence. Like, if, especially if you're going to put us in a big emotional situation, like, hi, how do we move forward, right? But no, it's more like I feel like I was reading something really new and really fresh, and something that I wanted to sit with because I hadn't been here before. And
mhm,
that's, I mean, I needed all of the voices, and there were a couple of people where I was like, ugh, I don't really like you, but okay, I get why you're
yeah,
here. Like, I needed that sort of 360
yeah.
experience that you gave me. It's just some of the details of some of these people's lives were very difficult, and I will totally own that they were very difficult to read about, but I'm still glad I did it.
Yeah, and I felt that way too. Sometimes I worried, like when I interviewed Sarah, the agoraphobic
Mhm.
woman who, you know, I met her on a Facebook site
Mhm.
for agoraphobics, and she was the head of the group, and she wanted to talk, but her story was so complicated and long, and
Mhm.
I was just not expecting her to say, I was sex trafficked over
Right.
and over again, just go into this deep underground. And I felt it that happened a lot,
Yeah.
where the story just it's just because the bubbles we live in, we don't always hear those stories. But
Right.
it turns out that's not that unusual. Like
Right.
people experience sex trafficking, domestic violence, so many levels in their lives, and we should be prepared for hearing those stories. And those are the ones we don't always hear because we focus so much on celebrities or
Right.
but there's people that just have this compounding of trauma and just unbelievable circumstances. And then there's some women where they were one woman, her friend touched her breast, and that was basically the entirety of her trauma.
Right.
And so I like having those two kinds of stories in the same space, because we can't really, I guess I've started to prefer the understanding of trauma, that it's like it's not what happened to you, it's its impact on you. And so it's, depending on who you are and what you've been through, that can be a range. We have no idea what's going to cause trauma for
Mm.
people. Some things are obvious, but others not so much. So I think making sure that I had that range was important, but kind of not trying to sterilize certain stories.
It's aftermath. It's what you do. You write about
Mhm.
aftermath. So here's a question though. Are you working on a new thing? I mean, I realize you've just finished this one, but do you subscribe to the I must be working on a new thing when the current thing is coming out into the world?
I am. I'm working on two different projects. And one has to do with sharing bodies.
Okay.
And that sounds a little bit abstract, but I think I'm going to look specifically at like reproductive rights and how we define family, sharing, whether it's surrogacy or donor eggs or, organ transplant, kind of looking at this new ways of like seeing community in these spaces that are being attacked.
Okay.
And I'm also working on something about the manosphere.
I want both of those books, please. I will sit quietly in the corner and wait, but I would like both of those books, please.
Perfect.
I mean, honestly, just the whole idea of sitting with aftermath, right? Like that is, if there is not a more universal concept, and it can be applied to so many things, large, small, intermediate, indirect, I mean, aftermath, right? Like that isn't, there's life, there's death, there's aftermath. It really does sort of feel that simple and that expansive at the same time. It's like you can get a lot. Yeah. So I'm really glad you do what you do.
Oh, thank you.
All right. You know what? That actually seems like a pretty good place to wrap this episode. So I'm going to say, Jen Percy, thank you so much. And I'm going to remind everyone that Demon Camp is out in paperback and Girls Play Dead is out now in hardcover. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for talking.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.